Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, the founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It is truly my honor to introduce today's speaker, Peter Levine. Dr. Peter Levine will be speaking to us about connecting to our body as healer. Peter Levine is the developer of somatic experiencing, a naturalistic and neurobiological approach to healing trauma. Dr. Levine holds doctorates in both biophysics and psychology. He served as a stress consultant for NASA in the early space shuttle development and has served on the APA task force for responding to the trauma of large-scale disasters and ethno-political warfare. He is the founder and president of the Ergos Institute for Somatic Education and the founder and advisor for Somatic Experiencing International. He is also a senior fellow and consultant for the Meadows Treatment Center. Dr. Levine is the author of several best-selling books on trauma, including Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, published in 30 languages, In An Unspoken Voice, and Trauma and Memory. He has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from Psychotherapy Networker, from the U.S. Association for Body-Oriented Psychotherapy, and from Attach. We welcome you, Dr. Levine.
Oh, thank you, Tia. Thank you for the introduction. That was very kind. And when I first started to work with trauma was in the late 60s and then into the 70s. And in a way, I was fortunate because the definition of trauma as PTSD was still another decade or so in the future. So I didn't know that trauma was supposedly an incurable brain disorder, brain disease, that one could at best, manage it with medications and with helping people change their thoughts. And of course, that's also important. I don't want to say that that's not important. And all of these different tools can help a person, each individual person in their own way. And it's another thing I'm really, really convinced that we each have our own trajectory to heal. And that it's a drive, it's an innate drive, as powerful as any drive to move towards transformation and wholeness. And that tapping into that is the key that I found in working with trauma. Anyhow, so in the 60s, I was realizing that so many people had what would now be called trauma, and that this was something that was happening not just in their minds, in their brains, but in the bodies as well. I mean, you think about it, you're driving in your car, and all of a sudden you look and there's another car coming right towards you, and you go, ah! That's a typical startle reaction. Now, what happens if that gets stuck, if we stay this way? Well, our body is continuing to replay the trauma, and until things shift in the body, then the trauma continues to replay itself as though it's happening in the present. And of course, that makes it impossible to be in the now. So again, my interest in body really became predominant also. And some friends and colleagues of mine have been really trying to get me to write a biography, which I actually have started. And so I look back at some of the most important influences in my life. And in 1964, I think it was around 1964, my friend Jack Kaplan, he took me to this workshop that was given by a woman named Charlotte Selvers. And this was a workshop for people who were, they were Zen monks living at the Green Gulf Meditation Center in Marin. And we spent the whole day picking up a rock and feeling the rock and feeling our feet and moving our bodies. And on and on and on and on. And at the time, quite frankly, I didn't know I had a body, really. And then I just thought this was just absolutely ridiculous. But then at the end of the day, this was at this church on Farrell Street in San Francisco. My friend and I, Jack and I, walked out, and the lights from the city and the Bay Bridge seemed like something so beautiful, something like I'd never seen before. And that was, in a way, my introduction to the body as healer, the body as the vehicle for transformative experience. And I think now in the mindfulness movement, there's more attention, thankfully, about the what's going on in the body, not just the thoughts. And again, I'm not saying anything negative about working with thoughts, but it's definitely not the whole story. So anyhow, in the 60s, I was working on some mind-body methods to work with people who had a group of people who had high blood pressure. And I found that getting them to relax a certain sequence of muscles in the neck and the jaw and the shoulders, that often the blood pressure would drop to a normal level. And I mean, sometimes it would drop 10, 20, even occasionally 30 points. And so I realized there was something here. So in 1969, my very, very dear friend, a psychiatrist named Ed Jackson, was asked to see this woman. I call her Nancy. And Nancy had been suffering from all kinds of physical symptoms, what we would now call fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, migraines, and so forth. And she was also suffering from severe panic attacks and agoraphobia, to the degree that she really wasn't even able to go out of her house alone. And even with her husband, you know, it was an ordeal. So anyhow, Ed Jackson thought, well, maybe at least if I could help her learn to relax, that might help, at least in some way, with her anxiety attacks. And so when they arrived, she and her husband arrived at my office. I could see her eyes were just wide. I could see the pulse in her carotid pulse was beating at a high rate. And I tried to reassure her that we were just going to do some relaxation exercises and so forth. And again, I could see the pulse was about 140 beats a minute. So I had her lay down as I worked with these particular muscles. And much to my gratitude, her heart rate started coming down, went from 140 to 130, 120, 110, 190, 80, 70. And you know, some of you who are therapists, if you remember the first time you were actually successful with a client, you thought, oh gosh, I really know what I'm doing. Well, of course you don't, we're just beginners. And I was just a very beginner, really, in developing this method. But anyhow, when it got down to this relatively normal level, then it shot up again to a much higher level. And if you can imagine the stupidest thing that anybody could say, which is what I said, exactly what I said, Nancy, you relax, you must relax, you need to relax. And her heartbeat started coming down, and down to 100, down to 90, 80, 70, 60. And she turned pale, and her eyes opened and locked on mine. And the words that came out of her mouth were, doctor, I'm dying, don't let me die, help me, don't let me die. And even as I tell that story, well, that must have been 45 years ago, I get a little bit of tinge in my chest. But, you know, I'm very well acquainted with that. And just by being aware of it and being aware of the rest of my body, the tension just passes and I'm back here online with y'all. So anyhow, at that moment, and at the end, also really not quite knowing why I did this, at that very moment, I saw the image of a tiger crouching, getting ready to spring. And then the words came from my lips, Nancy, there's a tiger chasing you, run, climb those rocks and escape. And at first I could see that that I wasn't being helpful. It looked like almost like she was even becoming more and more upset. I encouraged her. I remember saying something like, Nancy, you can do it. You can do it. Just feel your legs as your legs are starting to run. Even though it's difficult, just feel them and notice them, and then notice and notice and notice. And so for the next 30 or 40 minutes, her body would, sometimes her hands would become icy cold, sometimes warm, sometimes there'd be deep, spontaneous breaths. And this kind of cycle went on for, as I said, for 30 or 40 minutes. And then towards the end, you could see that she was deeply relaxed. Her body was relaxed. Her color on her face and her hands were indicating that she was deeply, deeply relaxed. And then she said, Doctor, do you want to know what happened? And of course, I'm supposed to know because that's my method. But I said, yes, yeah, please tell me. And she said, well, when you said there was a tiger, I could see that. I could see that image in my mind's eye. And I tried to run, but my body, it was like I was trying to run through water, through quicksand. And I couldn't move. But then when you continued to encourage me, I started to feel my body. I started to feel power in my body. Power in my body, important here. It's a positive experience, contradicts that of helplessness, and it's something that goes on in the body. And that at that very moment, I knew that I was on to something. So anyhow, she described that, you know, that she was able to feel her legs, feel power in her legs, feel her body move. She could feel her arms and her legs and feet climbing the rocks. And then she got to the top and she looked down and she saw the image of the tiger, but she knew that she was safe. She knew that she was going to be okay. And then the image of the tiger kind of faded out, and the image of her when she was 4 years old and had a tonsillectomy with ether, under ether anesthesia, and she was terrified. She was held down to the operating table by nurses and doctors, just struggling to get free. And her body, for the next 20 years, when I saw her, she was about 24, her body was needing to run and escape to be able to do what it couldn't do then, because her body was held down, because she was unable to make the escape that her body needed to do. And that after that session, that was the last of her panic attacks, although we did a few more sessions to work with more of the physical symptoms. So again, that was the beginning. And that was the beginning of a journey that's lasted, as of now, 45 plus years. And actually the image of the tiger, okay, so where did that come from? Well, I was taking a graduate seminar in the biology department at Berkeley at the time. And one of the professors, Don Wilson, described the little known phenomenon called tonic immobility. So if an animal is restrained, its body goes into a state, something like collapse. It's unable to move. It's called tonic immobility. And usually it's time limited. The person goes into it and then they come out of it. Nancy went into it and she couldn't come out of it. And what I discovered was, yes, people who are traumatized, their bodies do go into a state of immobility, of tonic immobility. And the reason they don't come out of it is because it gets potentiated by fear, what I call fear potentiated immobility. So in other words, when her body was starting to release from that shutdown state, the fear of her body sensations kept her stuck in that loop. And so going over body sensations, I discovered, was another really important facet in working with trauma, so that the person, when they start coming out of that traumatic state, that they're not frightened by the very sensations that bring them out of the trauma. So anyhow, the pieces started coming together. And so then I started to begin to teach what I was developing at the time to a group of Berkeley therapists. They would meet every week or two at my treehouse in Wildcat Canyon, just outside of Berkeley. And I would try to find ways to explain what I was doing, because I knew that it was transmissible. I knew that it was learnable. I just didn't know how really to teach it. And that became, in a way, the driving force in my whole development, to the point where, again, I start thinking back. So there were about a dozen, 13, 14, 15 Berkeley therapists there. And now apparently, somebody recently told me that there are about 50,000 therapists worldwide, and it's taught in 44 different countries. So that answered my question. Was it transmissible? Was it learnable? But what was some of the ways to make it that way? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my PowerPoint, and I'm going to go share screen. Okay, so anyhow, that's where the title for my first book came from, Waking the Tiger, the story of Nancy's. But just again, looking at that animal and the focus and the power that's conveyed in its body. And we have those same powerful instincts that lie inside of us, that are locked in our bodies, waiting to be accessed, waiting to be make a healing journey, to start a healing journey. Oh yeah, often people send me books, that, want me to read it or recommend it or write a blurb. And one book I just happened to flip through the pages, I came to this quote, and it's, trauma is not what happens to us, but rather what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And when I saw it, I thought, God, I totally can relate to that. Then I noticed that it was a quote from In An Unspoken Voice. So this is so important, because the tools, without tools, trauma rules. And we have to have the tools, but we really need also to be held in a way with a holding presence. I don't mean necessarily physically, but you can see in the picture, but really being held by that other, that person who's there witnessing our suffering and witnessing our healing. Okay, let's flash back to 2005. And I was walking across the road to my favorite restaurant. It was a February day, a warm February day in near San Diego. And I was crossing the road and gonna get something to eat and then go to visit my friend for his birthday. And as I crossed the sidewalk, crossed the crosswalk, this teenage driver didn't see me because there was a truck parked there, and hit me at about 25 miles an hour. I was thrown up into the air against the windshield and then back up into the air on the road. And I remember just laying there and not really, actually not being in my body, really being above my body, looking down And I felt, if you could even say felt, but I was absolutely helpless. And thankfully, a woman came by and she announced herself. She said, hello, I'm a doctor, actually a pediatrician. And I think I remember at that moment, pediatrician, that's exactly the specialty that I need right now. And she asked, is there anything I can do for you? And I said, yes, please stay here with me. And she sat down next to me on the road and took my hand in her hand. And you know what I was just describing with Nancy? Those same kind of physiological reactions went on for me. And she had taken my pulse, and it was about 160, she said, which was not untypical if you're in a situation like that. And then when I was loaded into the ambulance, going to the hospital, and thankfully I did not sustain any serious internal injuries, although that could have easily been the case. And the paramedic was, checking my vitals, and I asked, what they were, and she said, I'm sorry, I can't really give that information to you. I can only give it to the doctor. And I said, half truth. I said, well, actually, I am a doctor, half truth. And she said, well, I think something must be wrong with the device because it keeps showing that your pulse is 74 and your blood pressure is 120/70. And it shouldn't be that normal. And I said, yeah. And I said, yeah, but if you're interested, I can tell you what I did, sort of. And so on the rest of the ambulance ride, I gave her a brief lecture as I'm giving you. Again, as I say, thankfully, there were no serious injuries. But as much as I know, all the tools that I know, and I was able to use all those tools as I did with Nancy and as I did with myself. And I needed to have that other there with me, helping to hold, help make a container for the terror and the helplessness that I was experiencing. So it's both the tools, but it's also the presence of the other, of the empathic other, the empathic witness. And that was the story oh yeah, that was the crosswalk. And this is something I think that we as a society really have denied. And I think it's now coming much more as people in, who are in the media are talking more about their traumas and so forth. But I still would say that trauma is perhaps the most avoided, most ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering, which can be treated. It can be treated. The bad news is trauma is a fact of life. Well over more than 50% of people have experienced trauma at some time in their lives. So it is a fact of life. And the good news is it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Again, with tools and with the presence of another, these experiences can be transformed through the body, through the living, sensing, knowing body. This is an image that gives me a great deal of pleasure to see. When I was teaching one of my classes way back when, one of my students sent me this photograph. And this is from a tradition in Japan called wabi-sabi or kintsugi. And the tea ceremony was an integral part of life in the old times in Japan. Well, it still is to some degree. So if somebody would come to visit, the host would pour a cup of tea, and or the family would sit around and they would pour cups of tea, and eventually these cups would crack, as you can see here. And what they did is they filled the cracks with gold. And the way I understand that, the way I interpret that, is that they believe that when somebody suffered damage and has a history and transforms that injury, becomes gold, becomes beautiful, becomes vibrant, not just patching the wound, but transforming the wound as represented by gold. In alchemy, gold is the transformative alchemical substance. This is really where we kind of got off into the wrong track. Monsieur Descartes, René Descartes. And he really said that mind and body are completely separate and that they're distinct. And this is what leads now to what's called the mind-body dualism. And he argued the nature of mind, that is the thinking, the non-extending thing, is completely different from that of the body. That is an extended non-thinking thing, and therefore it is possible for one to exist. It is possible for one to exist without the other. In other words, we have body or mind, but not body-mind. And of course, this really took us off in the wrong direction. And this is the Belgian surrealistic painter René de Magritte said really the same thing quite graphically. And there's no just question about that. Yeah, the mind and the body are separate. And there was a Jules Pfeiffer cartoon where this man was walking around and he said, "This is my body, this is my head. I really don't need my body except to carry my head from place to place. And if it weren't for that, I wouldn't even need a body." Well, that's where still, I mean, and of course, trauma really amplifies this to the highest degree. But this is really a kind of a cultural thing that, and I think that's in a way, Tia, what your conference is addressing, is the bringing the body into medicine, into mindfulness, into the healing processes. Now we'll get to the psychotherapy when people are traumatized. And if you can see it off in the left, it's a Graham Wilson cartoon. And the analyst is saying to his patient, to the analysand, Mr. Fenton will soon have you sorted out. But when the body has become fragmented, that talk is not going to get at it. That we really have to work with the body and access that living spirit of the body that exists within all of us. Okay, now, again, when I started to try to teach this to the group of Berkeley therapists, I had a dream, and in the dream, these images came up, and I called it the stream of life. So here we have a stream, we have the banks of the stream, and we have the meadow or whatever that's outside of the stream. And if we imagine ourselves like a boat, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 my life is but a dream. We experience the sense of flow, of continuity. Now, during our life, and we have full access. Now, at different times during our lives, we're challenged. And if we're fortunate enough to have parents or guardians that really support us, that we'll go through these turbulences and return to the full flow of the stream. Now, trauma is something very different. So again, these are developmental obstacles. They are, of course, they are important in our development, but it's not the same as trauma. Trauma is something different. And trauma, it's as though there was a breach, as though, of course, it's not really from outside, it's what's going on inside. It's as though there's a force that indicated by the red arrow that breaks the hole in this protective barrier, and there's we're completely overwhelmed. And actually, Freud, although he certainly did not go in the right direction after this, he defined trauma really quite presciently as trauma is a breach in the protective barrier against stimulation, leading to feelings of overwhelming helplessness. The only change I would make is trauma is a breach in the protective barrier against over stimulation, leading to feelings of helplessness, of overwhelming helplessness. And so what happens then, once this breach occurs, a vortex forms. A vortex forms outside of the stream. And whenever the person gets anywhere near the trauma, they're sucked into the trauma. We see this in reenactment, in hypervigilance, and nightmares, and so forth. The person continues to be compelled to relive the trauma, to replay the trauma as though it were happening today. Now, yeah, and so it just gets swept up in the trauma, swept up into the middle of the, what I call the trauma vortex. So what people will do, or how the nervous system will adapt, is in order to avoid being sucked into the trauma vortex, they go as far as they can, these are so-called avoidance behavior, as far as they can away from the trauma pull, and away, at least until they get past it enough to come back somewhat to life. But the problem with this is that because of this, yes, they avoid the trauma, but the whole flow of their life has been greatly, greatly reduced. So it's not a good solution. It really doesn't do the trick. And so I thought, okay, but in working with people, I knew this wasn't the case. I knew there was a third possibility, and here is the third possibility. The third possibility is that whenever there's a vortex in one direction, there always forms, or at least almost always forms, a counter vortex, a vortex spinning in the opposite direction. And this vortex in red is outside of the mainstream. The blue vortex is within the mainstream. So there now becomes a new possibility in resolving the trauma. And what happens is when a client is guided, when they're supported enough, and this means using like basic grounding techniques in the body, being aware of, our hands slowly maybe opening and closing, and just to get the feeling, the physical sense of what it feels like to have a hand that opens and closes, feeling your feet, feeling feet on the ground, and just noticing breath. And just notice in breath, and particularly just noticing out breath. And just see if it's possible to let the breath go all the way out until it wants to take itself in for the next in-breath. So using those type of tools, sometimes we call them resources, mostly the body as a resource, they are pulled now, directed towards this counter vortex, and pulled around the corner of the counter vortex, and then moving into the outer realm of the trauma vortex, and then going back into the mainstream, and doing this multiple times, like peeling the onion layer, like the onion layer peeling layer by layer. And each time we're taking some of that energy that's been compressed and releasing that energy in the body, because the energy is something that's in the body. It's not something really that's in the mind. And each time doing that and taking some of the power out of that trauma vortex by integrating the polarities. There's another thing that I've talked to quite a bit to different mindfulness groups and meditation centers and so forth. Like I was at Plum Village a couple of years ago, and then before that, Spirit Rock, which is in Northern California, Jack Kornfield's meditation center. And often what happens is when people start meditating, they go into this counter vortex and they have these most wonderful, beautiful visions. But then they either become, well, they become very often dissociated and or wind up in the middle of the trauma vortex. It's kind of like a tunneling, like a quantum tunneling. And this, I suggested was what sometimes is called the bliss bypass. So we go into these greater and greater expansions, but we deny the contraction part. So expansion, contraction. And when we only allow one, then we don't really come to the transformation of those to that healing process. Also, if you notice in this little boat, there are two figures. There's a red figure and there's a blue figure. And what that represents is that we have to hold together the contraction, which, hold on a minute, let me. So there's a process which I call pendulation. And pendulation means that if you move into a state of contraction and you're guided, then there will be an expansion, and then a contraction, and then a greater expansion, and then a contraction and a greater expansion, which is different than just expanding, expanding, expanding. And so people have asked me, well, how do you know that? I said, well, 45 years. And also Carl Jung talked about this quite a lot in his books and in his lectures. So again, to be able to, when we start feeling the sensations that are related to trauma, it feels like there's a constriction, and there is. And so we don't want to go there. But again, if we can move into that gently, then there'll be an expansion, and then another contraction, and then another expansion, and another contraction, and another expansion. So it's holding those two together, the contraction and the expansion, which allows not just the diminishment of symptoms, but for a transformative process like you saw in the wabi-sabi of the teacup that's been healed, that's been repaired with the gold inlay. And again, up in the upper right-hand corner, you see each time they go between contraction and expansion, there's another uniting of those two polarities. And as you do that, then you move back into the mainstream, into being and feeling alive and real. In a way, trauma is the opposite of vitality. And when we feel vitality, then there's not the trauma. It's kind of like one or the other. And I was curious about this, about these two vortices, these two opposite vortices. And long story here, so let me just go through it quickly, is I was invited to meet a Tibetan Lama in Berkeley. And I explained to him basically what I was just talking to you about. And I asked him if there was any correspondence that he was aware of in Tibetan Buddhism. And I could see his eyes light. Oh, by the way, when I went over to visit him, the first thing he did when I invited me in, he poured me a cup of tea. And okay, so anyhow, I asked him if these ideas, these concepts were, somehow expressed in different types of Buddhistic teachings. And he said, well, yes, this is very similar to the Kumnai tradition, which is a body-based tantric tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. But he said it goes beyond that, that this is something that has come up throughout world history and is in many traditions, and probably has its origin in the Stone Age temples, the ancient Celtic temples, Stone Age temples. And so immediately I ran up to the Berkeley Library and I looked up Stonehenge, which is a Stone Age temple. This is the temple to the inner sanctum. And in order to pass into this inner part, you have to pass through this obelisk, this stone, and you see these vortexes and counter vortexes in opposite directions. And then I thought, okay, so this is something that I just happened to stumble upon, but was not unique to me. This is something that I think has been known literally, not just for centuries, but for thousands of years. And that I guess my task was to take this ancient knowledge, the shamanic knowledge, if you like, and put it in a form where it would be applicable to modern science, to modern psychology, modern contemporary therapies and so forth. But really, this is something that was not new, but somehow I was gifted to be able to bring it in a way that would be acceptable in Western scientific form. And again, this is a woman that I know. She's a Hopi artist, and she allowed me to use this painting of hers. And again, you see the vortices outside the mainstream and inside the mainstream. So, and I talked to her about that, and she said, well, she didn't know that much about it, but when she showed it to one of the medicine men, he said, oh yes, that's a picture of how healing happens. And here are galaxies again with the two vortices and spinning in opposite directions. So, what is trauma? Okay, so we go back to a little bit to Freud's definition, but it's an event which overwhelms the brain, the body, and particularly is too much for the autonomic nervous system to manage. And it involves being stuck in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which is one that's usually not really very well known, but that's kind of like the Stockholm syndrome, and collapse. And that's when we just collapse without energy. And that's the way I was for the last several days, just without any energy at all. My body was collapsed, but thankfully, we knew what to do with each other to get ourselves out of that collapse and back into life. Thankfully. Okay, so I'm going to show you now a video. Actually, I'm going to have to. I'm going to show you a video of a predator-prey encounter between a cheetah and an impala, a group of impala. And this is a race that goes on at 65, up to 65 miles an hour, 130 kilometers an hour. And it's a life or death, not just for the impala, but for the cheetah, because it's the females that do the hunting as well as nurturing the young. That if she is unable to make a kill within 6 tries, that her cubs will perish, and she will perish. The species will perish. So again, to just kind of keep that in mind when you're watching this. And as a suggestion, you might try to become aware of what goes on in your body and your mind images, thoughts, as well as body sensations that occur as you're watching this. And again, think of this chase is going on at this astronomical speed of over 65 miles an hour. But the cheetah, the fastest land mammal, is only able to do this for about 20 seconds. After that, she's expended. And so if she's unable to make the kill within that period of time, then the cubs will not survive, will not be fed. Okay, so.
She dashes forward. This time, Duma has killed a good-sized female impala. Unfortunately, in the plain, one's own gratification often stimulates another's envy. Duma's catch has been witnessed from start to finish. The spy is Mama Kingua, a spotted hyena. She knows that Duma is completely exhausted by her final sprint. And yet, things may not finish as we thought they would, for sometimes the weak are capable of cunning trickery.
Okay, by the way, that is not photoshopped. That's an actual encounter that was filmed by this French group. When the narrator says, you know, of cunning trick or something like that, it's not a trick. It's a profound physiological, in a way, with human psychophysiological reaction that gives rise to a state of immobility and numbness. And this is probably mediated, at least in part, by endorphins, by internal opioids. And when I was laying down, that dissociation was, I'm sure, was some kind of a state like that. But then when this coast was clear, you saw this remarkable thing, and I imagine you all then took an easier breath of relief when you saw the impala rebound and go back into life. So what I'm going to show you here, again, is a way of kind of looking at the energy dynamics of what happened. Okay, so this is, here's the impala, and they're grazing and nurturing their young in an uplands meadow. There's no sense of threat, but then a few molecules of a scent, or the snapping of a twig, alerts the group to the possibility of danger. So they're more on alert. Their energy is more. Now they're still not into full fight or flight energy or flight energy, but then when they sense and they see the cheetah lunging towards them, they take off with all the energy that they possibly can mobilize. This is the fight, flight, survival energy. And in that moment, when the impala is brought down, all of that energy, it's still there, because you saw at the end when the coast was clear, that energy just got expressed again in the flight response, and off the impala went. Now, what happens with people, again, this is from my experience over the last 45 plus years, is that when this energy starts to release, that energy that gets locked again in the autonomic nervous system, in the body and in the mind, that it gets locked there. And what happens is that the energy then frightens the person, because the sensation is going to be intense. But again, that's where we go into the sensations one small amount at a time, one small amount at a time. Again, pendulation. And this I call titration. So that instead of releasing that energy at all at once, because if we do that, we'll most likely feel overwhelmed the way we felt the first time, but we're overwhelmed the second and third and fourth time. So what happens again is that if we can release this energy, this survival energy, this flight energy, this powerful survival energy, one small amount at a time, and each time letting it come to equilibrium and letting it come to rest and come to equilibrium and come to equilibrium. So all of the energy is restored, but not all at once. And I call that titration, because again, what will happen if all of that energy is released at once, there's this explosion of energy, and then the likelihood is that that fear of that will then cause a contraction again, and the person can be re-traumatized. And that's certainly not what you want to do with your clients, with your patients. So again, the way that we know this energy, that we can contact this energy, is through body sensations. Why don't I just take a couple of questions and then we'll go on.
All right. Well, I'd say the primary question is about the empathic witness and whether that can eventually become oneself, or whether in the process of this pendulation and titration, the empathic witness needs to be an external person.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. Certainly, if somebody has thankfully has had a life with parents who are caring and loving, if you were lucky enough, a lot of this, and you have a one-time incident. Actually, one of the books that I wrote, my friend Maggie Klein and I wrote, called Trauma Proofing Your Kids, A Parent's Guide for Instilling Confidence, Joy, and Resilience. Once children learn from their parents that they can move through these traumas, because the kids are going to experience trauma. They're going to fall off the bicycle, hopefully not shatter a window and wind up in the emergency room, or swallowing something and winding up in the emergency room. Once they learn to do that, it does somewhat become innate. But so many of us we did not have this as our, as our beginnings in life. And so we really do need that other to be there. Yeah, of course, we really become more and more skilled at the types of skills that I just have been talking about. But it really helps to have the other person there, and definitely when things happen, I'm certainly able, and I know thousands of people that I've worked with, they're able to just let it move through. But it's always, there's a Motown song that goes like, it takes one to stand in the dark alone. It takes two to let the light shine through. And I think, if you have that person there, I think it's actually, it's also a way of more deeply connecting with that person. In a number of SE trainees who do couples therapy, when the couples learn to help each other when they get stuck in their trauma, it really solidifies the relationship and makes it even more deeply bonding and connecting. So yeah, of course, you can do some of this alone, but if you've had a lot of trauma, a lot of early trauma, you really, really also need to have somebody there who stays in their body language. I'm here, I will stay with you, I'll be with you. And just hearing those words, if I just say those words, I just kind of feel my body relaxing. So yeah, you can do some of this alone, and it really is nice to have somebody there to be a guide, and to be a witness. Yeah. So hope that answers your question. So the
Yes.
answer is yes and no.
Well, it was very, very important and central to people's interest in how to engage in the work. And if you could say a little bit more about identifying the core aptitudes in the external empathic witness, if not everyone has access to a certified somatic experiencing
Right.
practitioner.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, well, some of the things that I'm doing now are really trying to do something. I'm doing something that sounds true for people with all of these chronic pain conditions. And so they can, I think it just released this month. So I'm guiding people through a lot of these different kind of exercises. And so it's there, you know, in media land. And so that's where some of my interest goes, like ways to empower people to be able to move through some of these stuck places, and to do it without a therapist, but with some kind of guidance. And I really do believe that we do need guidance, but it can come in different forms. It really can come in different forms.
Well, if you were to enlist a friend, what might you say to your friend, such as you know, cues or invitations around how to be the empathic witness for the person making the request?
Well, it's like, you know, what I said to that woman, the pediatrician.
Yes.
Please stay here with me. So we can say, and first, to know that to guide another person, we have to be able to first, you know, be present within ourselves. And that means present within our bodies, our thoughts, but especially in our bodies. And so that's the first step. So we really can't be present for another unless we're also present for ourselves, for ourselves. And so the more people that learn tools like this, I really believe this, truly believe this, the more we can help each other and the more we can create a better world. I mean, I hope it doesn't sound too outlandish, but I really believe that with these tools and with people's willingness, that we can have a different kind of society. A different kind of society. You know, and trauma is not just in the individual. Trauma also is in the society, and trauma is not just what happens to us, you know, in our lives, but what's happened also to our relatives, to our grandparents and grandparents and so forth. But I do believe with these kinds of tools that we can learn that are not so difficult. They really aren't. I mean, I definitely recommend at least taking the first year of the SE training. But to really just learn some of these skills, to practice some of these skills, we can be present for ourselves and present in ourselves to be present for others.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess maybe I continue on.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Okay, now we're going to do a little exercise, but first we're going to do a little bit of science here. And there are three basic systems that go on in the body and in the brain and in the autonomic nervous system. And to the back of the brain stem, there's a nucleus called the 10th cranial nerve, and that's where the vagus nerve comes from and spreads out through the entire body. It goes to all of the internal organs, including below the diaphragm, but including the heart and the lungs as well. It's really a remarkable nerve. I will be saying more about that as we go on. Okay, so that's in the back of the brainstem, and that's in the middle of the brainstem is a nucleus, or it's not really a nucleus. It's a reticular system of nerves that are crisscross each other, and it's called a reticular activating system. And when that gets overactivated, that stimulates the sympathetic fight or flight response. Then in the very front of the brainstem, in the very front of the brainstem, actually, let me get back here to my PowerPoint. The ventral part of the brainstem, another part that's the most forward part. Dorsal just means back, ventral means front. That's really all it is. It's Latin, or it's from the Latin. And this nerve here, it's also a part of the vagus nerve, but it's a much more recent. The 10th cranial nerve goes back many millions of years, but not so with the ventral part, and that's myelinated. The dorsal is unmyelinated, so it's much more primitive. Anyhow, that goes to three places. It goes to the muscles in the throat, the larynx and the pharynx. It goes also to the muscles of the middle ear, and also through another nucleus to the muscles in the face, especially the muscles around the eyes. And this is where my friend, really my very dear friend and brother in crime, Stephen Porges, formulated the polyvagal theory, that you have these two vagi, the dorsal-vagal and the ventral-vagal, and very different functions. But let's look at this at the dorsal-vagal system. So here's the vagus nerve, goes down throughout the whole lower part of the body, then also the heart and the lungs. Actually, Darwin in the 1860s called this the pneumogastric nerve. Pneumo, lung, gastric, gastrointestinal system nerve. And I believe he also was aware that this nerve, which by the way is the largest nerve in the body by far, the largest nerve in the body by far, and this nerve is actually 80% afferent. In other words, 80% of the gigantic nerve communication system, two-way communication system, is sensory. It's from the state of our organs back to our brain. So here, for example, you walk out into the street, you open your door and you walk out into the street, and boom, you see somebody hit by a car, or you see somebody falling off a bicycle. And all of a sudden your guts go, ugh. Now, that's the motor part of the vagus nerve. So the brainstem recognizes injury, threat and injury. It sends a signal down into the guts, and the guts go, ugh. And then if you're looking and you're seeing, oh God, the person really looks like he's hurt really badly, that signal then gets amplified. So, okay, you see the injury, the yuck signal goes down the vagus nerve, our guts twist, our heartbeat skips a beat or slows often. And then that actually is picked up by the sensory part of the vagus nerve and goes back into the brainstem where it's amplified. And actually, Darwin called this nerve the pneumogastric nerve, and he wrote, this is in his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. He wrote that this nerve, I can't believe it, this guy was so right on. He said, this nerve is responsible for gut wrench and heartbreak. So if this doesn't get resolved and continues to amplify, then our guts will tend to become more sensitive. We will potentially even develop irritable bowel kinds of symptoms, which again is something that we see quite commonly with post-COVID. And again, there's really significant evidence that a lot of the symptoms in post-COVID, in long-haul COVID, are mediated by the vagus nerve. So let's do a little exercise together. Here's the situation. You see somebody injured. your gut twists. That twisting goes up to the brainstem where it gets amplified and then descends again and gets ugh, ugh. And then again, it can become chronic and you start having GI type symptoms. So, so here's an exercise that you're welcome to do with me. If it feels like it's too much, maybe just listen and watch me. So we have what I call a positive feedback loop, but with negative consequences. So for example, the yuck in the guts gets amplified by this positive feedback loop. And so what we need to do, remember at the very beginning, I said trauma, or the resolution of trauma, transformation trauma, is to be able to cultivate new experiences in the body, experiences that contradict, that are opposite to those of overwhelming helplessness. So what we want to do is stimulate these receptors in the gut, in the belly, and then just change that feedback loop to one that is a feedback loop that is positive in the sense that it feels good, that it feels safe, that it feels better. So the idea, and I just came across this just by kind of random occurrence, the idea, and I'll demonstrate it, is I take an easy full breath, and then on the exhalation, I make the sound voo, as though it's coming from the belly, which it is actually, it is coming from the belly. And then just letting the sound and the breath all the way out, just allowing the breath to go all the way out, and then just waiting and allowing this new breath to come in, filling belly and chest, and then taking again a second breath. So I'll demonstrate it here. And I will just then invite those of you who wish to do it with me or just to do it, okay? So I'll just do it first. So easy full breath. When I let the breath and the sound all the way out. Then just let the breath come in on its own, filling belly and chest. And again, and as you do that, just become aware of body sensations for sure, but also if any images come up or if any particular thoughts come up, but especially particularly notice your body sensations. So let's just do this. We'll do it a couple of times. And then maybe some of you want to share what you're noticing. Okay, so let's take an easy full breath. Let the breath and the sound all the way out. Nice, nice. Yeah, and then just wait. Allow the breath to come in on its own, filling belly, chest. Lovely, nice. Just notice sensations, feelings, images, or thoughts, and just kind of meet them with curiosity. So if you want to do this, we can do this a little bit more powerfully, a little stronger, but again, only if it feels right to you. But let's just get a little feedback, what some of you have noticed. Can we do that, Tia?
Yes, I'll begin. I felt the vibration throughout the neck and down through into the abdomen, and then some warming, particularly around the throat and neck, and then down into the area just below the sternum.
That's exactly what happens. I mean, that's the basic idea of this, is we switch out of the places where we're shut down and come back into vitality, into life. That's really, really the idea. And again, when we're in, especially ongoing trauma, our whole body shut down. Well, like with, I work with, again, not just with COVID, but with thousands of people who have what are sometimes called conditions of chronic fatigue, where we're really shut down. And this is not the whole story, of course, but this gives an example how we can shift out of this very gently, very gently. I remember we did a retreat for military people a few years ago, actually out here in Maine, near where I am right now. And I just led the group in a couple of exercises. This exercise was one of them. And one of the young men said, okay, he said something like, I'm really pissed off. In order to get to where we just did in like 2 minutes, I had to meditate for 4 hours. That's okay, meditation is great. But again, if we know, there's Archimedes said, if you give me a place to put my lever, I'll move the world. And I think these are one of these levers to move our internal world, to move out of shutdown, back into life, back into vitality. Again, the idea in somatic experiencing is not to erase traumas, but to really restore aliveness and vitality, and in that way transforming trauma. Anyhow, thank you for your feedback. And again, I hope that some of you had, in some way, we all have different experiences, but that some others of you also had similar kind of experience. Yes? Okay. Again, you see the similarity. They're not exactly the same, but they are saying essentially the same thing. And anybody who wants to try this, we can do a little addition to this exercise here, because it brought your jaw into awareness, right? So here I start with the same exercise, Vu, and then a little bit with the jaw, and I'll show you how. And we'll just do that again once or twice, and just become aware of whatever is going on in our bodies and in our minds. So starting with the Vu. Shall we give it a try? Anybody else who wants? So it's like a little bit of a growling noise, and opening my jaw just where there's a resistance, and then letting it close. Anybody? What are you noticing, if I might ask? Yeah, exactly. And again, this is something that's so simple that when we can shift that autonomic superhighway away from shutdown, and of course, we all, not just complete shutdown, but we go through, especially the last 2 years, when we all were living with a large degree of fear and uncertainty and loss. Over time, we shut down and shut down and shut down, and it's so gradual that we may not even notice that we're shutting down. And then in doing an exercise like that, it just brings us back into aliveness, into vitality, and say, oh, that's what's been missing. Yeah. Yeah, right. Look, chanting's been around, as far as we know, literally thousands and thousands of years. And it wouldn't stay around unless it did something beneficial. So, and there are many different kinds of chants. I haven't seen this chant, the use specifically of the vu sound, because often people say, well, is that the same as om? Well, om is more coming from this part, it's coming from our chest, our upper chest and throat. Om vibrates up here. The vu specifically vibrates here in the belly to shift the vagus system out of shutdown back into aliveness. So this is a very specific chant. Maybe some of you have seen it somewhere else or heard it somewhere else. And I love they asked about music festivals. Yeah, and that's wonderful, coming together and singing together. You know, there's a video that I have. It's really beautiful. There was a shooting in Manchester, England. And then a year later, people came together and they were singing together as a group. And it's so moving. You can probably get it online. Manchester survivors singing or something like that. Singing is so important. And it's something that we've lost in our, in our kind of humdrum, digitized world. In being together with people, in sound and singing. Yeah, I think that's something that's sorely missing. Yeah, chanting is wonderful. And again, this is something that has a specific function. I guess you could say it was a type of chanting, but it's for a very specific purpose. And really it's to shift the autonomic state that we're in. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Levine, you would speak to the different contemplative movement traditions and how an individual can recognize when that movement work is a resource for the pendulation process.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think more and more that people I know, people I've had contact with, they're more and more doing more embodied meditation, body mindfulness. And I think really, and I don't know exactly who has these online, but I know there must be online some, kind of meditation, body-oriented meditation groups. And the body I think is really the ultimate practice to help repair this mind-body dualism that is so prevalent. I mean, in order to get through school and then university and then graduate school, you really, I really kind of lost track of my body. And so if we're, doing some kind of a academic to get at least to balance that with these kinds of mindfulness exercises and so forth. But I'll ask Melissa if she can just find some more practices. Because I know Jack Cornfield, and I know that in the Plum Village, they do a lot more body-oriented. And I think, and Rick Hansen, who's written a number of books, he's a friend. And he also, actually, he said, God, he was giving a lecture once, and I was in the audience, and he didn't know I was there. And he said, and we in the mindfulness community just got it all wrong. We need to study with Peter Levine to bring the body in. So I think now more and more people are bringing the body into the mindfulness and meditation movement. So I think there's lots of resources for that. Alumni is a beautiful tradition. It's a tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, and it's very much oriented to the body experience and emotions as being water flowing into water. It's a beautiful, beautiful tradition. And again, things like Tai Chi and Qigong and other like 5 elements kind of meditations. There's so much now, I think in a way the genie is out of the box, that you're not going to be able to stuff the body back into the mind.
Thank you for making that A change in the arc of history.
Right.
Oh, we have just a few moments left, and there's been a theme of questions, if I may ask one more, and that is, you have the helpful graphic about the banks of the river and the flow of life, and then the rupture to the bank that the trauma can create. And people are wondering if, I'm going to paraphrase it, if that area of the bank will always be a little more vulnerable, or whether you see it as something that becomes solid and firm and a part of all the same quality of the riverbank.
Yeah, you know, an analogy that I sometimes give is if you break a bone, you know, and you go get the cast. I mean, the cast actually isn't it's repairing the bone repairs itself, but you're just giving it a place where it can rest and let its, you know, its own self-healing mechanism occur. And very frequently, where there's been a break in the bone, where the break was, it's actually stronger. And I believe that that's also the case with trauma, that our banks are more solid, but also more flexible, because I didn't bring that part in with it, you know, with that metaphor. But yeah, I think absolutely, definitely, we can be stronger. Well, it's like, again, coming back to that wasabi cup. The cup is stronger. It's made stronger with the gold, and the gold that came from the injury itself. So like the injury in the bone, I really believe our traumatic injuries can leave us stronger, more self-compassionate, and more compassionate to others. So yeah, do whatever you can to do whatever meditation brings you closer and closer.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that very nourishing and promising image of golden riverbanks where there was rupture, we want to thank you wholeheartedly for your life's work and for being with us today and for guiding us through these inspiring insights.
Okay, well, yeah, great. Okay, thank you. And thank you all, and good to meet you. I'm gonna see if I can see where you are. Nope, I don't see you. But anyhow, I know you're there.
Thank you. Best wishes to you.
Okay, anyhow, good to meet you, Tia, and the other people on your group, and maybe see you sometime around and around. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.